The world knew Louis Armstrong's smile. They knew the trumpet, the gravelly voice, the joy that seemed to pour out of him effortlessly on every stage from New Orleans to New York, from Paris to Tokyo. But in October 1965, in a small hospital in Ghana, West Africa, there was a performance that would never appear in any archive, never be photographed, never be mentioned in any biography. No cameras, no recording equipment, no press release. Just one man, his trumpet, and a room full of children who would not live to see Christmas. What happened in that whitewashed hospital room over the course of 2 hours would remain a secret for decades, known only to a handful of nurses who were too moved to speak about it, and a musician who never once mentioned it in any interview for the remaining 6 years of his life. This is the story of the performance nobody saw, and the humanity everyone forgot to look for. Before we understand what happened in that hospital, we need to understand the man who walked through those doors. By 1965, Louis Armstrong was not just famous. He was a living monument. He had transformed jazz from a regional curiosity into a global language. His trumpet had spoken in ways that transcended words, and his voice had carried warmth into millions of homes. But fame had built walls around him, walls made of expectations and schedules and the relentless machinery of celebrity. Everywhere he went, people wanted the performance. They wanted the smile, the sweat-soaked handkerchief, the infectious energy. They wanted Louis Armstrong the entertainer. Very few asked about Louis Armstrong the man. And that distance, that gap between who he was and what people needed him to be, had grown wider with every passing year. In 1965, Armstrong was on a goodwill tour through Africa, part of a U.S. State Department initiative to improve America's image abroad during the height of the Cold War. The tour was ambitious, exhausting, politically charged. Armstrong was in his 60s, his health already fragile, his body worn down by decades of relentless touring and a lifetime of pushing through pain. But he went anyway, not because the State Department asked, not because it was good publicity. He went because he believed in music's power to connect people across every barrier that politics and history had erected. He believed that a trumpet could say things that diplomacy never could. The official itinerary did not include the children's ward at Korlebu Teaching Hospital in Accra. That was never part of the plan. Armstrong was scheduled for concert halls, formal receptions, carefully orchestrated media events. But on the third day of the Ghana leg of the tour, something happened that would quietly derail those plans. A nurse named Sister Margaret Oken, who worked in the hospital's pediatric terminal care unit, had written a letter, not to Armstrong's management, not to the State Department, but directly to the hotel where she knew he was staying. The letter was simple, handwritten on plain paper, the English slightly formal in the way of someone writing in their second language. "Mr. Armstrong," it began, "we have children here who will not see tomorrow. They have heard your music on the radio. It brings them joy in their final days. If you have even 1 hour, it would mean everything to them, and to us. We do not ask for publicity. We ask only for your presence." The letter reached Armstrong's room on a Tuesday morning. His manager, Pierre Tallery, intercepted it first, as he did with most correspondence. Protocol dictated that such requests be politely declined. Armstrong's schedule was already overwhelming. His health was precarious. Adding an unscheduled hospital visit, especially to a terminal ward, was logistically complicated and emotionally draining. Tallery prepared a standard response, the kind that expressed gratitude for the invitation while explaining that prior commitments made it impossible to accept. But before he could send it, Armstrong saw the letter on the desk. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. "Clear tomorrow afternoon," he told Tallery quietly. "I'm going to the hospital." Tallery started to protest, but something in Armstrong's expression stopped him. This was not a request. This was not negotiable. "I'll go alone," Armstrong added. "No press, no cameras, no entourage, just me and my trumpet." The next day, Armstrong arrived at Korlebu Teaching Hospital in a plain car, dressed simply, carrying only his trumpet case. No announcement had been made. No preparation beyond Sister Margaret quietly informing her colleagues that he was coming. When he walked through the doors of the pediatric ward, the nurses on duty barely recognized him at first. Without the spotlight, without the stage persona, he looked like what he was, an aging man, tired from travel, but with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put people at ease. Sister Margaret met him in the corridor. She was a woman in her 40s, her uniform crisp despite the heat, her face lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for the dying. She extended her hand, and Armstrong shook it with both of his, a gesture of respect that surprised her. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Armstrong," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "Thank you for the letter," Armstrong replied. "Tell me about the children." There were 14 children in the ward that day. Their ages ranged from 3 to 12. Their diagnoses varied: advanced malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition-related organ failure, infections that antibiotics could not touch in bodies already too weakened to fight. This was 1965 in West Africa. Medical resources were limited. Terminal meant terminal. These children had been moved to this ward not for cure but for comfort, to die with whatever dignity and gentleness the nurses could provide. Sister Margaret explained all of this as they walked slowly toward the ward's main room. Armstrong listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Do they know I'm here?" "No," Sister Margaret said. "We thought it best to let you decide how to approach them." Armstrong nodded slowly. Then he smiled, but it was different from the smile the world knew. This one was smaller, more private, tinged with something that looked like sadness and determination mixed together. "Let's not make it formal," he said. "I'll just walk in and see what happens." The ward was a long room with windows on one side, letting in the bright African afternoon light. 14 small beds lined the walls, each one occupied by a child in various states of wakefulness. Some were asleep, some stared at the ceiling, a few were sitting up, talking quietly to each other or to the nurses who moved between beds with practiced gentleness. The room smelled of antiseptic, and something else, something harder to name, the smell of bodies slowly shutting down. Armstrong stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. Then he walked to the center of the room, set down his trumpet case, and opened it slowly. The click of the latches made a few children turn their heads. One of them, a boy of about 7 named Samuel, sat up straighter in his bed. His eyes went wide. "That's Louis Armstrong," Samuel whispered to the girl in the next bed, loud enough for half the room to hear. The words rippled through the ward. Children who had been lying down tried to sit up. Nurses paused in their tasks, watching to see what would happen next. Armstrong assembled his trumpet with slow, deliberate movements, giving the children time to understand that this was real, not a dream brought on by fever or medication. When the trumpet was ready, he lifted it to his lips, but he did not play immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, making eye contact with as many children as he could. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive texture that made it instantly recognizable. "My name is Louis. I heard you folks like music, so I thought I'd come play a little bit for you. Is that all right?" A chorus of weak yeses and excited whispers answered him. Armstrong smiled again, that genuine smile, and then he began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative almost, as if he was testing the room's acoustics, feeling out the space. He played "What a Wonderful World," but not the version the world would come to know from the famous recording made 2 years later. This version was slower, more tender, stripped of everything except the melody's essential sweetness. The trumpet sang through the ward, and something extraordinary happened. Children who had been listless moments before seemed to brighten. Eyes that had been dull with pain took on a kind of focus. Some of the younger children smiled. One little girl, no more than 4, began to hum along, her voice barely audible but completely in tune. Armstrong played for 5 minutes without stopping, moving seamlessly from one song into another, each one chosen instinctively, responding to the energy he felt in the room. He played "When the Saints Go Marching In," but gently, without the usual celebratory bombast. He played "Blueberry Hill," finding the hope in the melody that often got buried under nostalgia. He played songs he had performed thousands of times before, but here, in this room, they sounded different. They sounded like what they had always been underneath all the performance, prayers. After the initial set, Armstrong lowered the trumpet and walked slowly to the nearest bed. A boy named Kofi, 9 years old, skin drawn tight over fragile bones, looked up at him with enormous eyes. "Do you have a favorite song?" Armstrong asked quietly. Kofi thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know the names of songs," he admitted, "but I like the ones that make me feel like flying." Armstrong's face softened. "Flying songs. I can do that." He played again, this time improvising, letting the notes soar and dip, creating the musical sensation of flight. Kofi's eyes closed, but not in sleep, in something like peace. For the next hour and a half, Armstrong moved through the ward, bed by bed, playing for each child individually, but in a way that included everyone. He would ask their names, ask them what they wanted to hear, and then he would play. Sometimes he played songs they requested. Sometimes he made up melodies on the spot, responding to something in their faces or the way they held themselves. One girl, Abina, asked him to play something that sounds like home. Armstrong asked her where home was. She described a village near the coast, the sound of waves, the smell of her mother's cooking, the feeling of red dirt under bare feet. Armstrong closed his eyes and played something that somehow captured all of that, a melody that felt like memory and longing and love all mixed together. Abina cried, but not from sadness, from recognition, from being seen and understood through music. Sister Margaret and the other nurses watched from the sides of the room, many of them in tears. They had seen visiting dignitaries before, brief tours where important people would walk through, express sympathy, and leave. This was different. Armstrong was not visiting. He was present, fully, completely present in a way that demanded nothing and gave everything. There was no performance in it, no awareness of image or legacy, Just a man with a trumpet, trying to bring a moment of beauty into a place where beauty was in desperately short supply. Around the 2-hour mark, Armstrong's playing began to slow. His strength, already depleted from the tour, was running low. But he did not stop. He kept going, moving to the last few beds, making sure every child had been acknowledged, had been played for, had been given the gift of his attention. The final child was the smallest, a 3-year-old boy named Kwame who had not spoken in days. He lay curled on his side, eyes half open, breathing shallow and labored. Armstrong knelt beside the bed, his own knees protesting the movement, and played directly to Kwame from just a few feet away. He played All of Me, but so softly, so gently, that the trumpet sounded almost like a lullaby. Kwame's breathing seemed to steady slightly, his eyes focused on Armstrong's face, and then, impossibly, the little boy smiled. It was a tiny smile, barely there, but unmistakable. Armstrong finished the song, held the final note for a long, sustained moment, and then lowered the trumpet. He reached out and gently touched Kwame's hand. "You're a brave boy," he whispered, "the bravest I ever met." He did not know if Kwame understood the words, but the tone carried everything that mattered. Armstrong stood slowly, his back aching, his lips numb from playing, his heart full and broken simultaneously. He turned to face the room. 14 children, all of them watching him with expressions that ranged from joy to exhaustion to something like gratitude. "Thank you for letting me play for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me something today. I hope I gave you something too." He carefully disassembled his trumpet, placed it back in its case, and closed the latches with the same deliberate slowness he had used when opening them. Sister Margaret approached him. "Mr. Armstrong," she began, but her voice failed. She could not find words adequate to what she had just witnessed. Armstrong understood. "They're beautiful children," he said quietly. "All of them. So much light, even in—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. As he prepared to leave, several of the nurses wanted to thank him, to express what the visit had meant, but Armstrong gently deflected. "No thanks necessary," he said. "This was for me as much as for them." He paused at the doorway, looked back one more time at the ward, at the children who were settling back into their beds, many of them looking more peaceful than they had in days. Then he walked out, down the corridor, out of the hospital, and into the waiting car. He did not speak about what had happened, not to Pierre Tallery when he returned to the hotel, not to journalists who asked about his day, not to his wife Lucille in their nightly phone calls, not in any of the hundreds of interviews he would give over the remaining 6 years of his life. The performance that had moved him more deeply than any concert hall appearance, that had stripped away every layer of persona and left only essential humanity, remained completely private, a gift given and received in equal measure, with no need for documentation or recognition. Sister Margaret kept that letter Armstrong had brought with him. He had left it on a table in the ward, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. She preserved it along with a brief account she wrote that evening, describing what she had witnessed, but she did not publish it, did not share it beyond a few trusted colleagues. The story remained within the hospital walls, passed quietly between nurses who had been there or who came later, and heard about the day Louis Armstrong played for the dying children. In the months that followed, several of the children who had been in the ward that day did pass away, including little Kwame and Samuel and Abena, but according to the nurses' accounts, their final days were marked by a peace that had not been there before. They spoke about the music. They asked to hear Armstrong's recordings on the ward's small radio. They seemed less afraid, as if the trumpet had given them permission to let go gently. The story might have remained forever hidden, if not for a journalist named David Obung, who in 1998 was researching medical history in Ghana, and came across Sister Margaret's written account in the hospital's archives. By then, Sister Margaret had passed away, as had most of the nurses who had been present that day. But Obung tracked down 2 surviving staff members who confirmed the story, who remembered the afternoon clearly, who could still describe the way Armstrong had knelt beside each bed, the way his trumpet had filled the ward with something that transcended music. Obung published a short article in a Ghanaian newspaper, and slowly the story began to spread. It reached jazz historians, Armstrong biographers, music journalists. Some were skeptical at first. There were no photographs, no recordings, no mention in Armstrong's own papers, but the consistency of the accounts, the specific details that matched Armstrong's known schedule and personality, eventually convinced most scholars that the story was true. What made the story so powerful was not just what Armstrong had done, but what he had chosen not to do with it. In an era where celebrity charity was often as much about image management as genuine compassion, Armstrong had given something purely, with no expectation of return, no calculation of publicity value. He had seen children who were suffering, and he had responded with the only gift he truly possessed, his music. Not the commercialized version, not the crowd-pleasing performance, but the raw, essential core of what music could be. Communication, connection, comfort. He had played for an audience of 14 in a hospital ward with the same integrity and emotional investment he would bring to Carnegie Hall. Perhaps more. Because here there was no applause to perform for, no critics to impress, no legacy to consider, just human beings in need, and an artist willing to meet that need. Decades later, musicians and scholars still debate what that afternoon in Ghana meant in the context of Armstrong's larger legacy. Some see it as the purest expression of his belief in music's transcendent power. Others view it as evidence of the private humanity he carefully protected behind his public persona. Still others argue that it reveals the limitations of how we understand celebrity and performance, how we reduce complex human beings to simplified narratives. But perhaps the most important thing about the story is simpler than any analytical framework can capture. Louis Armstrong saw children who were dying, and he gave them beauty. He gave them attention. He gave them the dignity of his full presence, and then he walked away without claiming credit, without leveraging the moment for professional gain, without even telling the story that could have enhanced his reputation. That choice, that act of genuine humility, might be more radical than any note he ever played. In a world that increasingly demanded visibility, documentation, proof of virtue, Armstrong chose invisibility. He chose to let the moment exist for itself, for the children, for the nurses, for the handful of people who were actually there. The performance nobody saw became in its own way the most important performance of his life, not because of its artistic innovation or its cultural impact, but because it revealed what he had always believed but rarely spoke about. Music was not about the musician, it was about the connection between souls, the sharing of something that could not be commodified or controlled, the brief shining moment when art became indistinguishable from love. Louis Armstrong died in 1971, 6 years after that afternoon in Ghana. His obituaries cataloged his countless achievements, the revolutionary approach to jazz improvisation, the millions of records sold, the films, the global tours, the status as one of America's most beloved cultural ambassadors. All of it true, all of it important, but none of it mentioned the 2 hours he spent in a hospital ward in Accra, playing for children who would never grow old enough to tell the story themselves. That absence is not a failure of journalism or biography. It is, in its own way, fitting. Some moments are not meant for history books. Some gifts are not meant to be publicized. Some acts of compassion exist simply because compassion is the only response that makes sense in the face of suffering. The trumpet he played that day was the same trumpet he had played on countless stages, the instrument that had made him famous and wealthy and beloved. But in that ward it became something else entirely. Not a vehicle for performance, but a tool for connection. Not a symbol of artistic achievement, but a simple offering of beauty to people who desperately needed it. The children in that ward heard Louis Armstrong's trumpet, but they heard it in a way no concert audience ever did. Stripped of context, separated from fame, played only for them in their final days. That is the story. Not of what Louis Armstrong accomplished in public, but of who he was when nobody was watching. A man who believed that every human being deserved beauty, deserved attention, deserved to feel valued, even, or especially, in their darkest hour. The legacy of that afternoon lives not in recordings or photographs or documented history, but in the invisible ways it rippled outward. In the nurses who were moved to deeper compassion in their work. In the families of the children who heard secondhand about the man who came to play for their dying sons and daughters. In the people who eventually learned the story and understood that greatness is not always measured in achievements, but sometimes in small acts of unnamed kindness. Louis Armstrong's trumpet spoke many languages over his lifetime. It spoke of joy and sorrow, of struggle and triumph, of American culture and universal humanity. But perhaps it spoke most truly in that Ghanaian hospital ward, where it said simply, "You matter. Your life has value. And in this moment, I am here with you." That is the performance nobody saw. And that is why it matters more than most performances the world did see. Because it was never about being seen. It was about seeing, about recognizing the humanity in children's society had already written off, about honoring their lives with the gift of presence and music, about being Louis Armstrong, not the legend, but the man who understood that sometimes the most important audience is the smallest one, and the most meaningful performance is the one that will never be applauded, recorded, or remembered by history. The world knew Louis Armstrong's smile, but the children in that ward knew something deeper. They knew his heart. And for 2 hours on an October afternoon in 1965, that was enough.